continue getting your reaction then to the announcement by the IEC. You would have heard the voice of the CEO, Simon Mabolo, just a short while ago, clarifying some of the issues. Joining us now, Professor Barry Hanyane. He is with the Northwest University and political analyst Sanusha Naidoo. Professor Hanyane, let me begin with you. Listening to the IEC, Simon Mabolo, it sounds very much like we're entering a period where what ultimately may be the result of the election in terms of the processes is going to be a negotiated process, and that perhaps, you know, we should be open to the fact that not everything is going to go according to what it has in the past.
Well, Kathy, good evening to your viewers. Yeah, obviously the whole process this time started rather on a patchy, kind of a rocky way. The involvement of courts in various forms, all the way to Apex as well, the challenging of certain decisions, and then the U-turn made in some of the decisions, in this instance relating to your candidate lists. But then, of course, we were operating in very strange, demanding circumstances involving the COVID-19 pandemic. So it was never going to be easy for the IEC to come up with a blueprint that would be smooth, satisfy all political parties. Already we are sitting with the DA suggesting very strongly that they are willing to take certain issues to court, which then, of course, characterizes the kind of rocky path that indeed these elections are beginning to experience.
Sanusha, credibility is key for the IEC, and one doesn't want to overstate the kind of questions that have been posed currently. But in order to maintain that, what is the IEC going to need to do, despite all of these changes, to ensure it doesn't lose sight of that?
Good evening, Kathy. Good evening, Prof, and the viewers. I think you're right. I think apart from credibility, it's also trust. And as Prof indicated, it is a very unprecedented set of circumstances in terms of not just the fact that we are in a pandemic, but also, you know, the nature of how you conduct elections and whether or not the kind of processes and frameworks that you have in place allow you to be more innovative. And I think this is a lesson to be taken in terms of how do you innovate on how do you conduct elections. I think that the issue of credibility and trust for the IEC has to be that it is free, that it's impartial, it's independent, that it's not necessarily being compromised, not necessarily by the pandemic, but compromised also by circumstances it finds itself in, particularly in terms of how it prepares itself for going forward. It's going to be a very fast-paced kind of preparation. I think all the kinds of issues that the CEO mentioned in the interview means that they're going to basically try and do this on the basis of trial and error. And right now, I think in South Africa, given the circumstances we find ourselves in, not necessarily because the pandemic has created them, but because we have been sitting in these structural conditions for quite a long time that have been exacerbated by the pandemic, and we find ourselves in a bit of a continuous loop around the way in which institutions have been functioning, questions of whether political elites and those that are in the bureaucracy take these institutions and people's concerns seriously. All of those things are going to be key factors that are going to determine whether the IEC still has that level of credibility. And we do know that trusting institutions in South Africa and political parties has reached a new low.
Professor Hanyane, how important is this issue of the court case going to be? Because I suppose what isn't a desirable situation is to have the IEC forging ahead with preparations for the elections, which it has to do, and at the very same time have those processes be called into question in the courts by some of the parties that have already indicated they will be doing as much.
Well, Kathy, we were sitting on a judgment that was issued last week Friday, right? And this judgment then says to the IEC, you guys must go ahead, but at the center of making sure that free and fair elections are delivered, the voters' role is key, which then says to the IEC, make sure that whatever you do, it's done in the name and advancing the welfare and the interest of your voters. But then comes these other related decisions. For instance, the party candidate list decision, as it were, which sadly it's in a way dividing the House. By the House, I mean the various political parties that must contest. And the IEC comes out to say, but then we have consulted, everyone else seems to be happy, and in a way are ready to make necessary compromises to make sure that our democracy becomes the winner at the end of the day. I'm not so sure about that. If of course, we have to take the word of the DA that is pretty much ready to take this matter to court and make sure that such decisions are challenged in the long run.
Professor Hanyane, do you believe that the issue of the candidate lists, if the ANC hadn't had such a huge bungling of its processes and really a great embarrassment for the party in that regard, and we had perhaps the majority being independent candidates who were sitting in the position where they were unable to register officials or register their candidates, do you think that the response that we're seeing from political parties would be different?
I think so. I listened to Kenneth Mishwe as part of his response, and he was clear that despite not being happy, they are not going to invest their resources in challenging the decision. We already know how the DA feels. Of course, bar the other political parties in coming out to declare their stance publicly. But my understanding would be that obviously opposition parties would then rejoice at the prospect of seeing the ANC outside of the competition loop, which in a sense would then be rendering those municipalities where they govern on a silver platter to the opposition parties. They would want to do that. No opposition party would stand back and not be part of a collective that claws into the power base of the ANC. So at any given time, opposition parties will relish the moment of seeing that moment where the ANC's power is somewhat reduced.
Sanusha, let me bring you in here and perhaps just taking a look at the role of the opposition parties and even the independent candidates. What do you think that the opportunity of reopening candidate lists, what does that do for them?
Well, I think, as Prof had indicated, I mean, obviously they were relishing the thought that the ANC may not be able to field register candidates because of the whole debacle. And, you know, some may argue it was a free pass that the ANC gave opposition parties and so forth. In terms of this process going forward now, I think you've got the DA that's going to litigate issues, and they've already indicated that what the decision was the IEC was, and if they were going to reopen the candidate registration process, then they're going to challenge that in terms of the litigation, and they've got their legal team on standby for that. The other point to make here is what I think is critical, and that is there trust across the board? Because as much as the ANC has this candidacy open now, or if it does go down that route, we also have to think about what the judgment will be in that litigation. Will it stall the process again? Will it cause the IEC to now rethink some of its institutional processes? What does this mean for that 21st, 22nd period of September where the candidate re-registration process opens? The other point I want to make, and that is whether or not we're assuming that the electorate will actually then start moving to other political parties in South Africa, particularly opposition parties, if indeed the ANC does not have any candidates, if they didn't actually reopen the candidate list. So we have a lot of speculation at this point in time. And for me, I think the electorate is still so dissatisfied, and the trust element is not only with the ANC, it's across the political party spectrum. And whether or not when you go to vote or you don't go to vote, do you think, is there the next best thing that I want to vote for? I don't think we're there. The South African electorate is really, really frustrated, in my opinion, about what they feel has constantly been taken into the crisis of the political landscape of political parties.
Well, one thing is certain, it's going to be a roller coaster ride getting us to those elections, whether it's the end of September or even the 1st of November. Hearing from Mabolo, 3 days of special voting, potentially, and 1 day of normal voting could see a 4-day election cycle. And so, yeah, we're certainly in for quite a ride. Professor Barry Hanyane, he's with the Northwest University, and political analyst Sanusha Naidoo.